About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in and talk to me a sec." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." I said, "We're going to war with Iraq? Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper. He said, "I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
Growing up, the narrative was always oil. So it was like we went to Iraq to get oil, like America always does.
We might find ourselves without adequate supplies of energy in the future.
All major oil fields in the South are now under coalition control.
But that's kind of the lazy explanation. It's not quite it. Oil's a part of it, but it's not the main reason. We went to war in Iraq because several powerful American men wanted to. Some of them thought it was vital. We had to. Others just wanted to project American power. But either way, here we are 18 years later. Nearly 10,000 Americans dead, over 200,000 Iraqis dead, over $1 trillion tax dollars spent. And the result? A Middle East that is less stable than ever, in part because of the US presence, and really because of it. How did this happen? I mean, I grew up and lived through this. I studied it as an undergrad, I studied it in grad school, and yet it's taken me until now to really take a hard look and to really understand exactly what happened. So this is how the US stole Iraq.
Saddam Hussein is a tyrant, a murderer, and a man who has started 2 wars. He is clearly someone who cannot be trusted or believed.
All right, so it's the night of 9/11. The country is reeling. Who did this terrible thing and why? How should the US respond? And it became clear very soon amongst intelligence and counterterrorism people that Al-Qaeda was behind it. This terrorist group that was mainly based in Afghanistan. Later that night, the night of 9/11, over at the Pentagon, which earlier that day had been hit by an airplane, a memo comes in from the Deputy Secretary of State. The memo is urgent. It's for the Defense Intelligence Agency, the people who spend their time doing all the intelligence for war and other defense purposes. And this memo tells the intelligence agents not to look into Al-Qaeda, the people they know did it, but instead to look into ways Iraq has been involved in terrorism for the previous decade. The intelligence agents who got this memo sort of scratched their head and were like, wait, what? What's going on here? These people were very familiar with the intel, and they knew that this attack had come from Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is like more than 1,000 kilometers away from Iraq. It is a completely different place. They speak a different language. It has nothing to do with Iraq. Afghanistan and Iraq are totally different. We had just been attacked by Al-Qaeda, and yet the Deputy Secretary of Defense is asking for information about Iraq and its ties to terrorism. The person who sent this memo was the Deputy Secretary of State, Paul Wolfowitz. And he was just getting started. A few days after 9/11, the president gathers all of his top advisors out at his forest retreat right outside of Washington, D.C. They were there to discuss how to respond to these attacks. The focus of this discussion was, of course, Afghanistan. How do we retaliate against Al-Qaeda, this terrorist group that has been given sort of a safe haven by the government of Afghanistan? So they're sitting in some conference room in some lodge in this forest retreat, debating how they're going to retaliate against Al-Qaeda. And who pipes up again but this guy, Paul Wolfowitz, this time with the support of his boss, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. So Wolfowitz pipes up and he's like, you know, 9/11 was a pretty sophisticated attack. There's no way that this ragtag terror group of Al-Qaeda could have pulled it off all alone. They probably had help from Saddam in Iraq. And then Wolfowitz says that when it comes to global terrorism, Saddam is actually the head of the snake. He actually said that, basically saying that Saddam is behind all of this. And everyone in the room is sort of like, what the hell is this guy talking about? Saddam Hussein is a really bad guy, but he's not the head of the snake of international terrorism. Like, what? All these people, these like very informed international like advisors. Oh man. After some astonished glances, the head of the Counterterrorism Center raises his hands and says, Mr. President, quote, we were attacked on 9/11 by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Saddam Hussein in Iraq has nothing to do with this. It's just like, I'm sorry. I feel like as an 8th grader at this time, I was asking these questions where I was like, is Iraq the same as Afghanistan? And here are like the leaders of our country having to explain that like Saddam Hussein has nothing to do with Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda. So this meeting at Camp David, they move on and they keep talking about these plans to bomb Al-Qaeda. But Paul Wolfowitz is stubborn and he does not give up. Later that day, there's a break in all of the meetings. It's like the afternoon. Attorney General John Ashcroft is playing the piano in the sort of lobby, and a few others were singing along these like piano spirituals that he's playing. Condoleezza Rice is one of these people singing along. President Bush is sitting over by the fire. It's like this rustic cabin, it's all cozy. He's drinking a cup of coffee, and who cozies up to him at the fire but Paul Wolfowitz? And Bush is like, ugh, here we go again. So he's like, listen, check out my plan. Half of Iraq's people live either way up here, where they don't like Saddam, they're Kurds, they've been brutalized by Saddam, they do not like him, or they live way down here in the south, which is right near the border of our good friend Kuwait. We could easily come into Iraq and take both of these big population centers. Oh, and in doing so, says Paul Wolfowitz, we could naturally take the major oil fields in Iraq, thus cutting off Saddam from his main revenue source. Or, in other words, he said, making Saddam, quote, the mayor of Baghdad. He would only have power in Baghdad. He would be cut off from the north and south of his country. In this moment, I can almost see George Bush's ears like literally perking up when he hears this last part about cutting off the oil supply. After all, Bush was a former Texas oil man, and he knew the importance of having access to oil. So this plan sort of intrigued Bush, and he literally said to Paul Wolfowitz, quote, why didn't you bring this up in the meeting? And Wolfowitz is like, well, I didn't want to like step on the toes of my superiors. And Wolfowitz, we know you just wanted to cozy up against the president and plant the seed of how easy it would be to take over Iraq.